Jane Francis de Chantal was born in Dijon, France, on January 23, 1572. Born into a family of nobility, Jane's father was the president, a high-ranking position in the French legal system. Her brother André became the Archbishop of Bourges. Jane's mother died while giving birth to Jane's brother when Jane was only 18 months old, and her father took over her care. He saw that Jane was spirited and intelligent and made sure that she was well educated in reading, writing, and even the arts, such as theater, dancing, and singing. She was also able to play many different instruments. Catechism was a large focus in her education, since at that time the Calvinist movement was at its peak. Her father wanted to make sure she not only knew her faith, but also knew why she believed it. One day, when she was only 5 years old, she challenged a family friend who was over for supper. This friend had left the Catholic faith due to the Calvinist movement, saying that the true presence of Jesus in the Eucharist was a lie. Very indignant, little Jane said to the man, "My lord, don't you know that by saying that it's a lie, you are calling God himself a liar?" The man laughed this argument off, and trying to placate Jane, he gave her some sugar plums. She took them and walked over to the fireplace and threw them into the fire, saying to the man, "Thus shall all those burn who disbelieve our Lord." Again, she was only 5 years old. Jane grew up to be a very beautiful woman, her intelligence and refinement making her an attractive prospect as a wife. But she turned down two hopefuls, and in 1592, at the age of 20, she chose and married the Baron Christophe de Chantal. They lived in the castle of Bourbon and were very happy. But Jane realized right away that her husband didn't handle finances very well, and as soon as she moved in, she learned that they were in danger of losing their home. Before marriage, Christophe had been a very gallant man and lived a carefree life, spending his money recklessly. Jane ended up taking on the full management of the entire estate and saved them from falling into poverty. In addition to this hardship, Christophe had also fathered a child outside his marriage, although it's not clear if this happened before he married Jane or during his marriage. Regardless, Jane gave Christophe forgiveness and understanding and accepted his son as one of her own, bringing him up with her own children. But despite his faults, Christophe was a kindred spirit, loving God and caring for the poor alongside his wife. They lived happily, hosting hunting parties and other entertainments, despite losing their first two children in infancy. One way Jane shared her blessings was by giving bread and soup personally to the poor who came to her door. Often, people who had just received food from her would pretend to leave and go around the house and get back in line for more. When asked why she let these people get away with this, Jane asked, "What if God turned me away when I came back to him again and again with the same request?" Later, a third tragedy struck. Jane lost her older sister, Margaret, and so Jane brought her 3 small children to Bourbon, living with her father-in-law while her husband was away at times in service to the king. Her father-in-law could be quite difficult to live with, and Jane had to practice much patience. She continued to manage the estates and also took care of the poor and needy. Jane brought her children up the same way she was brought up by her father, with good education and making religious conversation fun, even about controversial subjects. One family friend stated, Jane could make even the stupidest jokes funny. Then in 1601, tragedy struck once again. Her husband Christophe was killed in a hunting accident. The man who accidentally shot Christophe was a good friend and was beside himself with anguish, so much that Christophe said to him as he was dying, "Don't commit the sin of hating yourself when you have done nothing wrong." In other words, forgive yourself. This would leave a lasting impression on Jane, who struggled in her grief to forgive her father's killer, as we will talk about in a moment. When Christophe died, Jane was only 28 years old, widowed with 4 small children. She was completely heartbroken and had no desire to marry again, and in her heart, she took a vow of chastity. But not all men respected Jane's wish to not marry, and some, who were attracted to her beauty and others attracted to her wealth, pursued her so much that she made a drastic move by carving the name of Jesus on her chest, something her spiritual director frowned on when he learned about it. After losing her best friend and husband, Jane struggled with depression. Later, she wrote about this, saying, "A few months after I became a widow, it pleased God that my whole being should be beset by so many different distressing temptations that, if He in His mercy had not taken pity on me, I'm sure I should have perished in the fury of that storm. For I could get almost no relief from this anxiety, and I lost so much weight that I became quite unlike myself. You would have hardly recognized me." Part of Jane's healing would be to forgive her husband's killer. As said before, Jane struggled very much to forgive the friend who took her husband's life, even though she understood it was accidental. Even so, she found it unbearable to even see him in the streets. She worked on this through much prayer, asking for the courage and grace of true forgiveness. Over time, she was able to meet him in the streets without turning the other way. Then she was able to smile at him while passing by, and then soon she was able to greet him. Eventually, she was able to have short conversations with him, and then finally she was able to invite him over for dinner. All this work and effort and God's grace finally won her over to true forgiveness, that she even became the godmother to his child. Being a very passionate person, Jane felt Christophe's death keenly. She dealt with her feelings by throwing herself into consoling her children during the day and grieving at night with tears, prayers, and fasting. She focused on the poor by giving them any leftover food they had, inviting them over for dinner, and offering them one of the castle's many rooms to stay in for the night. Though she was used to having everything, she recognized that God was asking much of her, and praying in her usual forthright way, she said, "If you ask everything of me, then give me the strength to give you everything." But then, a year after Christophe's death, she received a letter from her difficult father-in-law, demanding that she come live with him in his castle in Monthlon. She closed up the estate and moved in with him in order to safeguard her children's inheritance. The stay there was not easy, as her father-in-law was very demanding, and she also had to deal with a difficult house servant who enjoyed being in charge of everything and yet didn't seem to know what she was doing. After managing her husband's estate for many years and being used to being in charge, Jane had to temper her own inclinations to not take over, especially when the housekeeper was not only incompetent but rude. But Jane practiced humility and patience, choosing to treat the housekeeper respectfully despite her rudeness, and even volunteered to educate and catechize her children. Jane struggled with her new station in life. She wished to escape to the walls of the convent, but her vocation of motherhood made this impossible. In 1604, her father invited her to come to Dijon to hear the Bishop of Geneva, St. Francis de Sales. This would be a wonderful day for Jane, because not only did he deliver such a powerful sermon on forgiveness that it brought her to tears, but she also said, "That's my spiritual director," for this had been revealed to her in a dream. She found out later that he had the same dream about her and revealed to him as well. They became fast friends, and he did become her spiritual director. He helped her navigate through her sadness and her desire to enter a convent, and encouraged her to find holiness in her vocation of motherhood by taking care of her children's needs. She soon began to see her children not as obstacles to holiness, but as instruments of it. He also was firm about her penances of fasting and prayer, and insisted on at least 7 to 8 hours of sleep at night. When she asked permission to use the discipline for bodily mortification, he forbade it, telling her to use patience instead. Patience would become her weapon of choice in all trying circumstances, and it would prove to bring her to high heights of perfection. At the suggestion of St. Francis de Sales, she divided her time between Dijon and Monthlon so as to attend to both her father and father-in-law. As their friendship grew, St. Francis suggested that instead of Jane entering a convent, that she should start a new order of women. This order would be to serve the sick and the poor and those in hospitals. Jane was torn with her desire to do something more in her life, but she also did not want to abandon her duties as a mother to her children. However, by now, some of them had grown and married, and sadly, her youngest daughter, Charlotte, had died of an illness. This left her 15-year-old son. St. Francis de Sales never forced Jane either way, but encouraged her to simply listen and discern. After much prayer, Jane realized she was being called to the religious life, and it was arranged for her son to live with her father, but her son did not make it easy. It's said that once he realized she was serious about leaving, he threw himself across the doorway, and with tears running down her cheeks, she stepped over him and left. But now biographers say that this is over-exaggerated. Although he did try to stop his mother from leaving, her son simply prepared a lengthy speech which she respectfully listened to. It was still a difficult parting, but she knew she was leaving him in good hands and needed to trust God. She left her remaining wealth to her children and moved into a small house on Lake Annecy that St. Francis de Sales had purchased, along with 2 other women who were also spiritual daughters of Francis. Here, along with Francis's help, Jane's leadership and management skills once again were used as she constructed the outlines of the new order, which would be called the Visitation of Our Lady. Like Mary, they would organize their lives between service to others and prayer. What made this order very unique was that they would take any woman who had a vocation, regardless of age or sickness. She even accepted a woman who was 83 years old. When people criticized her for this, she said, "What do you want me to do? I like sick people myself. I'm on their side." The Congregation of the Visitation was canonically established at Annecy on Trinity Sunday, June the 6th, 1610. Despite the business with her new order, Jane had not forgotten her children and was still very involved in their lives. Concerned about one of her daughter's materialistic ways, she counseled her so well that her daughter eventually asked her to be her spiritual director. So she was, and Jane also gave spiritual director to an ambassador, as well as her brother, who was an archbishop. Her advice always reflected her very gentle and loving approach to spirituality. Should you fall even 50 times a day, never on any account should that surprise or worry you. Instead, ever so gently set your heart back in the right direction and practice the opposite virtue, all the time speaking words of love and trust to our Lord after you committed 1,000 faults, as much as if you had committed only one. Once we have humbled ourselves for the faults God allows us to become aware of in ourselves, we must forget them and go forward. Jane still struggled with depression and would continue to struggle with this for the rest of her life. She never specified the content of these troubling thoughts, except that she once described them as suggestions of blasphemy, infidelity, and unbelief. At first she fought it, but St. Francis would tell her not to do this, as it gave the temptations of her dark and depressive thoughts even more power. Instead, he told her to ignore them. He gave her this analogy. "Recently, I was near the beehives, and some bees flew onto my face. I wanted to raise my hand to brush them off. 'No,' a peasant said to me, 'don't be afraid and don't touch them. They won't sting you unless you touch them.' I trusted him, and not one stung me. Trust me, don't fear these temptations. Don't touch them, and they won't hurt you." Jane took this advice to heart, and the approach helped, but the temptations and darkness didn't go away completely. They would be her purification for the rest of her life. Towards the end of Jane's life, she said, "I've had these temptations for 41 years now. Do you think I'm going to give up after all this time? Absolutely not. I'll never stop hoping in God. If I can keep from offending God in spite of all this, then I am content with whatever it may please Him to allow me to suffer, even if I must suffer for the rest of my life. I want only to do it knowing that He wants me to, and that in suffering I am being faithful to Him." During its first 8 years, the new order was also unusual in its public outreach, in contrast to most female religious, who remained cloistered. A second convent was established in Lyon. Soon, people became so scandalized by the people in active ministry that St. Francis de Sales was forced to make it a cloistered community following the rule of St. Augustine. This change brought Jane to a new level of holiness, as she had to step away from her designs and instead surrender to God's will. Although God often wanted Jane to take the initiative, such as handling her husband's estate, handling servants, and now in charge of a new order, there were times He also desired for Jane to practice submission and being in the background. "Let God be the architect of our souls," she would often say. "We are only the tools in His hands." This was how Jane became holy. As one priest put it, virtues are believable when they are put to the test. Many people admired Jane and what she was doing, and many wealthy people wanted to support her. Through them, Jane and the nuns relied on the support of others for food, as well as their own fruit of their labors. The order had 13 houses by the time St. Francis de Sales died, and 86 before Jane herself died. The new houses didn't just spring up out of nowhere. Jane and her sisters always started with nothing but a prayer. Before the start of any new house, Jane would gather the sisters in prayer and place the matter in God's hands. In one example, one town that they wanted to build a convent in was very resistant to the idea. Jane herself went to talk to the people by knocking on doors, listened to the townspeople's concerns, and even tended to their sick. Soon she had their complete trust, and they not only gave their consent, but their help as well. One baker gave the new convent their daily bread, and children would often come visit with wildflowers for their chapel. Having once been a very outspoken and blunt woman, and always ready to put people in their place, now Jane was learning humility and gentleness of spirit. She was quiet and slow about her words, always praying before reacting. Jane counseled the other mother superiors of the new convents by teaching them to handle their sisters in much the same way that she had brought up her own children, using joy and love. "Let your soul breathe," she once wrote to a superior. "For we are not angels, but women of flesh and spirit both. Let your convent be full of light and songs and silence in equal measure." When two sisters in one convent fell into a conflict, she gave the wisdom that she herself learned after her husband's death. Writing to each sister individually, she tried to help each one see the other's perspective. She ended the letters with, "Forgiveness is not an emotion, but a decision to let love have the final word." To another sister who had just lost her mother right after she entered the convent and had withdrawn into silence, Jane, who well understood grief, said, "My dearest daughter, the Lord has not taken your mother to leave you orphaned, but to draw you more closely into his own embrace. Let your tears fall, for they are holy, but do not let them drown the voice that calls you by name." The Visitation order was not just for the sisters, but for lay people as well, and they were encouraged and invited to stop by the houses for prayer and any other sort of spiritual counsel. One bishop, after having visited for a week in one of the Visitation houses, said he never felt closer to God after spending time with the humble women of the community. He later wrote, "Their joy is not the laughter of the world, but the peace of those who have laid their burdens at the feet of Christ." In 1622, Jane's dear friend and spiritual director, St. Francis de Sales, died. Jane's heart was once again pierced with grief, but now she knew how to grieve. Her new spiritual director was St. Vincent de Paul, and although her friendship with him was not the same as it had been with St. Francis de Sales, she felt deeply blessed to have him as her spiritual director. In her last years, Jane continued to struggle with bouts of depression as well as spiritual dryness. She chose not to worry too much about either of these things, but rather accept them as a part of the purification that her soul needed. She wrote to a sister who was complaining about her prayer life, "Prayer is not always fire and light, my dear one. Sometimes it's silence, dryness, and even boredom, but the bridegroom does not ask us for feeling. He asks for fidelity. Stay at your post, even when you feel nothing. That is when you love most purely." On December 14th, 1641, Jane died peacefully when she was visiting one of the Visitation houses. She was 69 years old. Her last recorded words before her death were, "Lean into the wound. It is there you will find the heart of Christ." After her death, St. Vincent de Paul had a vision of her soul being received by St. Francis de Sales, who then escorted her to heaven.